All right, so this is a review of my solar system slash, they call it a generator, but it's really not a generator in my mind, but that's kind of the slang term that people have used for it. So I'm just going to kind of be walking through each component and what it does, and as I kind of explain this to Prathima. So, so anyway, so we're going to start with kind of the life source, and that is the battery, and we'll get these cables out of the way. So this is a single 12 volt, 100 amp lithium battery, which is what the LiFePO 4, you can't see the 4 on there, stands for. So you can see the battery there on the bottom and all your cabling hooked up. So that's essentially what stores your energy, obviously, just like on your car, just acts a little bit differently. We'll talk about how that gets charged so that you can use it here shortly. So the next big piece of equipment is the inverter. So that's what takes the 12 volts that is generated by your battery, and this inverts it. Cut it on. So this will invert the 12 volt power and make it 120 volt power, which is what we use in our household. And so you can see there it's got the plugs on the front so that you can just plug something into it, and with the battery charged it will convert that and you can use it. Now all the size of the battery and the power, all that kind of comes into play, which I'm not going to get into in this video, it's too in depth. But I will point out that this is a 2000 watt or 2200 watt inverter. I think you can see that, which is a pretty big one. They're actually kind of, a lot of them it's kind of smaller. I actually have an old one I've had for years. It's a 200 watt, and it will not run a whole lot of equipment. It's just not big enough. But 2200 will power up a lot of stuff, like, for example, your refrigerator, which is kind of one of the main reasons that we got this system. We have power outages here a good bit, and we kind of wanted something to be able to keep the refrigerator going during those power outages. Or the other thing is kind of to be able to do an extended outage if there were really some kind of a solar attack or something like that, where we were out of power for
solar attack?
a few days. Yes.
Or cyber attack?
No, solar attack. They have solar attacks too.
Okay.
So, but anyway, just kind of thinking for, stuff that might happen and trying to be prepared for it. But so in general, really all you need is those two components to be able to generate power. The battery to have it stored, and then the inverter will convert it and run the refrigerator. And the refrigerator runs roughly around 160 to 200 watts. So if you think about that, a 2200 watt converter, I mean, that's a lot of power there that's really not being needed, but you may have other things that you would want to plug into it. But then it gets back to, well, how long could you really run that with only a 100 amp battery? And again, that depends on your power consumption. So just as a general rule from what I've read and found out is, on this 100 amp battery, for just a single refrigerator at 200 watts, we will say it would keep that going for about 24 hours. And that also, keep in mind that the refrigerator is not running the whole 24-hour period. It cycles on and off to keep itself cool. And so therefore it's probably only running maybe 20 to 30 minutes. Well, I'd say on average probably 20 minutes an hour. So that kind of gives you an idea. But I mean, this actually has, if you can see it, that's a USB port that you could plug in phones and charge phones and that kind of thing as well if you need to. And I also have them up here on the charge controller that we'll talk about shortly. So that's kind of the inverter and those two. So if you had that charged, then that's really would be able to get you your power. Now, to charge the battery, there's a couple of different alternatives. And I'll start with the more conventional, easy one first. Is I actually bought this AC converter, which just plugs into a regular house outlet. And then you have these battery clamps that I've got back here that you would just hook up to the battery down there. And then you just plug it into your power and it would charge just kind of like your car battery charger would do. There's actually a couple of lights in here. One's red that just shows that it's active, and then the other is going to show if once the battery is charged. It is a 15 amp charger, so if you're talking about a 100 amp battery, then you kind of got to figure out, well, let's just say the battery was at 40%, so that's about 60 amps that you'd have to charge, so it would take probably about 3 hours in that case for that charger plugged in to get the battery charged back up. So you can kind of do your calculations based on that. So then the other way to charge is the more involved, and that's to do solar panels and use this charge controller. And so that's kind of where that comes into play. So to talk about that a little bit is you actually have, so these lines are coming in. This is actually the solar panel, and you can see these little icons right here. So there's your solar, and you can see where those lines are coming in. And this is your battery feed. So those lines go from there down to the battery. I've got into a circuit breaker. It's a 50 amp circuit breaker, which will also cut it off. So this, I can push this and it flips the breaker, and then the whole thing went off because there's no power from the battery. So that's just, breakers are just like in your house, are there to protect an overload. If there was a surge or whatever reason coming from the charge controller to the battery, then that would prevent damage to the battery. So cut that back on, and then we got our power back. So the purpose of the charge controller is to take the power in from your solar panels, and then that regulates, and it has a parameter set up inside the controller. You tell it what kind of battery you have, and then it knows kind of the limits that it should get up to and discharge to as well before it kind of shuts itself off or goes into what I would call trickle mode. And because you don't want to put too much juice in your battery, you'll damage it, or it's got to have some kind of way to regulate how much goes in there and cuts it off. Now I will go ahead, I forgot to say this about the battery. It does have what they call a BMS, which is a battery management system that kind of goes along and does the same thing. It's supposed to be able to cut, I think, the battery off if it goes into an overload situation or whatever. So I've got some paperwork here that I'm gonna have on the back side of my little unit there that kind of talks about the battery and what it does. So I'll go ahead and show you this. What are you doing? You have a question?
Well, yes. Will the lithium battery degrade over time?
It will, but that's one good thing about them, is they are designed to last a whole lot longer than a regular, say like a car battery, or they have what they call it's a gel battery that people used to use a lot. So these are kind of, the lithiums are more the latest thing. But for example, like a typical car or marine battery, you can probably only charge it up and discharge it for like 400 cycles, they call it. But they typically last around 3 to 4 years. Whereas these lithium, you can cycle them about 3,500 to 4,000 times and typically have a lifespan of 10 years. So even though they're a lot more expensive, like this one was almost $400 versus a marine battery that's about 120, you get a lot more life out of them. Plus, you can discharge them a lot lower than you can a regular battery, because they don't recommend discharging a marine or car battery below 40 or 50%. So therefore, you can't really take it full advantage of its amperage. Whereas this one, you can technically take it down to 5 or 10% if you had to. It's not recommended. It's best to stay around 20 at the lowest. Um, so you can kind of see based on that information that you have these percentages and then the voltage that correlates to that. So in this case, you can see at 100%, you should be 13.5 volts, and then down to 10 or 20%, you're at 12.8, 12.9. So that's kind of your low end range. And you can see now, based on the meter off of the inverter, that we're at 13.3. So when we cut the solar panels here in a second, it should be able to get a little bit of charge at full viewing out of it. So let's look at the numbers on the charge controller up here. So you have this setting that kind of shows you, see if I can get it lit up a little better. It shows you the charge controller and then the battery information. You can tell it's good because it's on green. And then this lower one is actually your 12 volt feed that you can connect to it. So that's a kind of a totally different output source that you can have a different fuse panel set up and have just specific 12 volt type appliances or chargers or that kind of thing that's very similar to what your car would do. And then you have this button here that cuts that on and off. So you can see your light comes on when that lamp is on, and you can also see it's cycling through. Yeah, so there it goes.
But you'd have to have cables to put in there.
Yeah, you'd have to have that wired up. But that button also does control these USB ports. So like if you want to charge your phone, or I'm actually have a clamp on light that I'm gonna put on here, so that if you were down in the dark or whatever and went to get this, that you'd be able to push that button and cut the light on, and it's gonna be USB light, basically a 12 volt that I'm gonna have plugged into there. So you could use that switch to cut it on and off as well, because it controls this as well as this part.
Okay.
That part there. So, where are you going?
Just give me space.
Oh, okay. So, you can see right now I've got the solar panels, they are off. So now we're in full sun, and well, pretty much full sun, but it's not going to last long. So let's see what we've got. So now we're still at 14 point something volts, and that's not a big deal. It's more the amperage that we're concerned about. So we're getting about 4 amps out of 5.5, so that's pretty good. And we're at 57 watts out of a 100 watt panel, so that's not too bad. It's not great, but you can see we are charging the battery now because our light's flashing. So if we go back to the battery, you can see now that we've got a little bit of bump in voltage. So, and then you can see the amps going into the battery is 4 amps. And so our percentage has come up a little bit as well. Now, one thing you got to notice is when you actually have a charge on the system, and that's true for your AC or the solar, the actual voltage or amperage that you're seeing going in is going to be a little bit higher than than the battery, just because it's got juice on it. So like, let's say it might show 90% and show 13.7 volts, but when you cut the power off of it and let it settle, what I would say, it's going to drop down at least probably 2 or 3 tenths. So it would drop back down to 13.4 probably in that case. So you kind of almost have to overcharge it a little bit to get it to the actual charged up state. So that's kind of it in a nutshell as far as charging. So in other words, the main thing to know is that the sun is your friend, and you can do all kind of research about your angles that it should be at and that kind of thing. But it's pretty cool. You got power being generated by the sun and coming in and charging your battery. So if you kind of go back to the numbers game, so kind of like we did earlier, so if we need another 12 amps to be fully charged, and we're only getting right now 1.7, but we're at 4, it's a little bit cloudy, then it's going to take another 4 to 5 hours to charge your battery up. So that's kind of how, thinking about where your solar panel should be placed, you kind of got to think about that as like you're going to need to be able to have sun for at least 4 hours a day, if not more.
That's why people put it on their roofs.
Put it on your roof. The bad thing about roofs is, one, is you can't get up there and get the snow off of it, which is not a huge problem for us. But two is if you ever have issues with your roof, then you got to take all your panels off to redo your roof. But it is usually the best place that gives you the most sun accessibility.
Do you have to keep the battery? Do you try to keep the battery charged all the time?
Yes, the lithiums do hold up better than a regular battery, but they say usually at a minimum, if you hadn't used them in about 3 months, you want to get it out and top it off, so to speak, and because obviously you want it to be charged up in case you never know when the power's going out, so you don't want to let them sit and run down. And that's kind of what this one has been sitting for a few months. It was fully charged, and then so I'm in the process of getting it back topped off so I can put this stored for a while.
So people that have this in their houses, they have some form of this. Like, if you have solar panels on the top of your house, they have some form of this. It may not look like this, but, right?
Yeah, your components are basically the same. You have the charge controller is where everything comes in and controls the amperage everything is being used by. And then they have a battery. If it's running a true house setup, obviously you have to have a battery bank. So at a minimum, I've seen 4 200 amp batteries, so that's 800 amps of power is usually kind of a minimum small cabin type situation. But if somebody's really running a bigger house off of it, you're talking about, kilowatts of power, which is, 3,000 or 4,000 amps to be able to do that. And then, but you still have a basic converter or inverter, I should say, that is taking all that power and then changing it back. Obviously, for a big house system, they're even bigger than this one is. But this one, I kind of went ahead and spent the money early to get a bigger one of those so that I could upgrade other things like adding more power with the battery, and that then I've got the inverter kind of already in place, because the money savings to get a smaller inverter right now was not that much different. So this all together, right now, for these components was about $1,100. You can buy these all-in-one kits that you probably have seen, like a Blue Eddy or a Jackery, and they usually start at about $2,000. The problem with them is, once the battery goes out in them, or some other component messed up, then you just basically have to throw it away. And where this one, you can kind of, work on each part individually, and plus it's cheaper. And then the solar panels, I got them from Harbor Freight, were 110 each, so that's about $240 or $220, and so all in we're about $1,350 for this setup. And then for those other all-in-one units, that $2,000 does not include the panels. And then some of them require you to have proprietary panels. Well, the panels, but the cable coming from the panel to connect to the charger is proprietary. So they basically make you buy their stuff, which is about double what you'd have to pay for other stuff. So after doing research and everything, even though this thing looks a little clunky, it's expandable and cheaper, and I think will be more beneficial in the long run. So here's the other thing I wanted to show. Once you get your batteries charged up to 100%, the great thing about the charge controller and what it does from overcharging is it will basically shut down the voltage coming in. Like you can see, I've got it, it's hard, but it's out there basically in full sun, and it was just coming in at like 5 amps, charging really good. But once it reached its voltage limit and it was charged, because you got this charger controller set up and matched to your battery, it knows the parameters to shut it off. And so now it's kind of gone into trickle mode and basically shuts off any voltage or amperage going to your battery. You can see it's 0 amps coming in right now and 0 amps going into the battery. So that's exactly what you want to see when your battery is charged up. You actually saw a little bit of an overload flash up just then. So that's cool. That's it's doing what it's supposed to, and you can see it even cuts that light off sometimes, but it's definitely not charging because it's not flashing at the moment.